You're talking a quarter of our population died because the Allies decided to attack us, occupy us, and take our food.
Nowhere in history has any government ever had so much value for a hostage to pay $1.2 billion per head, per hostage.
And the note was a note from Roosevelt to Churchill saying, "Sir, your fly is open." And Churchill writes back on that same note, he says, "No worries, the old eagle will not fall out of its nest."
Well, hi there. Welcome to episode 347 of Roqe. I'm Jian. And before we begin today's show, a related question, a question about history's gaps, about what is chosen to be remembered and what is conveniently forgotten. Why has the devastation of Iran during World War II been largely ignored? Now, take it slow. How much do you know? Think about it. Many of us are familiar with the sweeping dramas of that epic global war, stories of courage and loss and liberation, the Nazis invading Poland, the Blitz in London, Hiroshima, Pearl Harbor. These are the tales etched into our collective memory, the landmarks of the 20th century. But Iran? Even for those of us who majored in history and political science, little was taught about Iran's experience during World War II. Little about the famine that ravaged the country, little about the occupation, little about the fact that Iran, neutral in the war, was invaded by Allied forces. Its sovereignty erased, its resources drained, its people left to starve, and treated with disdain. Why has the devastation of Iran during World War II been largely ignored? It's a question that feels poignant as the world continues to grapple with Iran today. The often neglected images of protests, bravery, and resilience. The disregarded calls for justice and freedom. It is history that reminds us that this is not the first time pain has been sidelined and suffering has been dismissed. And of course, if there is no understanding of the past, how can the future be cast? Why has the devastation of Iran during World War II been largely ignored? Here's the quick version of the story. In 1941, Iran declared neutrality, hoping to avoid the war's devastation. But geography made neutrality effectively impossible. The British and Soviets invaded, aiming to secure a supply corridor and access to Iran's oil. Reza Shah, who had worked to modernize Iran and assert its independence, was forced to abdicate. His son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, took the throne under circumstances where outside powers made it clear they were in control. This wasn't a strategic maneuver. It was a calculated removal of power, a chapter where Western imperial greed once again came to flower. The occupiers drained Iran of its resources, leaving the population to starve. Food was diverted to serve Allied troops. Famine swept the country. Diseases like typhus spread unchecked. Millions of Iranians died, not in battle, but in their homes, from hunger, disease, and neglect. Why has the devastation of Iran during World War II been largely ignored? Maybe because, as we've come to realize, history is written by the victors. And in this case, from a largely Western perspective, where the Allies are the heroes and their actions are rarely questioned. Acknowledging the suffering they caused in Iran complicates that narrative. And let's be clear, this is not to condone the atrocities of the Axis powers. The horrors perpetrated by Nazi Germany are undeniable. But Iran's plight doesn't fit into a narrative dichotomy of good versus evil during the war. And so it has been something largely in the West to ignore. Add to this that Iran's destruction wasn't as cinematic as other parts of the conflict. No bombed out cities, no iconic battles, no burning buildings, no desperate screams, just shattered lives and stolen dreams. Just the quiet violence of exploitation. But then, hang on. The blame also doesn't rest solely on the West. Within the Iranian community, this chapter of history has often been overlooked as well. It has faded into the background, overshadowed by the more dramatic struggles of recent decades, the revolution, the hostage crisis, the protests of today. Sometimes it's easier to not talk about more atrocities of the past. But this story matters, not just because it is a tale of suffering, but because it is a testament to resilience. The devastation of Iran in World War II wasn't just a tragedy, it was a moment that tested the endurance of a nation that refused to break, a people forced to bend but never forsake. And to ignore this history is to deny its lessons. To erase the suffering is to repeat the indifference. And maybe that's the point. Iran's story during World War II, like so much of its history, is a reminder that silence is complicity, that overlooking a nation's pain doesn't make it disappear, it only amplifies its echoes in the generations to come. Why has the devastation of Iran during World War II been largely ignored? Because forgetting is easy, because it's convenient, and because expecting fairness in historical narratives is absurd. But the truth has a way of finding its voice, and history has a way of demanding to be heard. All right, coming up, a conversation with author Sepehr Haddad and his brand new book focused on a family trying to make ends meet in Allied-occupied Iran during World War II. But first, Gazelle Sharmahd on the harrowing tale of her kidnapped and murdered father, Jimmy. This is Roqe, episode 347. Let's turn it up to 11. It's November 21st, 2024. This is Roqe. Hi there, welcome to episode 347 of Roqe. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Hello to you from Toronto, hello to you from Canada. Salam Dostan Aziz, Durud Bar Shoma. I hope you're doing well wherever you are tuning in from around the world. Good to have you with us across our platforms on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, SoundCloud, CastBox, Telegram, now in full video on YouTube. If you haven't watched our last episode from last week yet, and that's called Will Trump Foster Regime Change in Iran, please do so. It is getting no shortage of reaction in our inbox. You want to check it out if you haven't already. Today, we want to look at a period in Iranian history that is, it seems, mostly overlooked. As I was saying in my opening essay there, World War II had major implications for Iran, caused great devastation and death, but it's not what comes to mind when most people reference that epic global war. So today, a conversation with an award-winning author who has just released a really compelling new book of fiction set in Iran during World War II that explores all of the dimensions of a period that has been largely ignored. Iranian-American writer and musician Sepehr Haddad joins me with his latest novel. It's called The Harmless and Necessary Cat. In fact, he was here in the Roqe Hub last week for a book launch and an engaging conversation in front of a good crowd, and we will bring you that conversation in just a little bit. But first, away from World War II and very much in the present day, you may have heard of the harrowing story of Jamshid Sharmahd. He was a 69-year-old German-American Iranian software engineer, longtime U.S. resident, who was kidnapped in 2020 in Dubai and taken to Iran. He was subsequently arrested on dubious charges, subjected to sham trials, and remained imprisoned until he was executed a couple of weeks ago. It's another deeply disturbing example of the atrocities and human rights abuses committed by the governing regime in Iran. Jamshid's daughter, Gazelle, has been a tireless advocate for justice, raising her voice across numerous media outlets since her father's abduction and since his murder. Gazelle Sharmahd joins me from Los Angeles right now. Hello.
Hi, Jian. How are you?
Well, first and foremost, I'm so sorry for the ordeal that you and your family have been through, and with regards to your father, our condolences, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you. I don't take condolences yet because we don't believe anything that the Islamic regime says. So we need first and foremost proof, somebody to see my father, somebody to confirm his death, the circumstances and everything, and going from there. So right now I'm still in the fight to get my father out of the hands of the kidnappers and murderers and to see what happened to him.
That's it. I'm glad you said that, because that's actually exactly where I wanted to start, which is that, I mean, obviously groups like Amnesty International, global human rights groups have condemned the atrocities committed towards your father, the kidnapping, the execution that some have talked about, forced confessions, sham trials. I know that you were skeptical in the immediate aftermath, as you just explained, that you don't necessarily believe anything the regime says. What is the latest that you do know?
See, we know very little. We know that my father was kidnapped in Dubai, taken to Oman, taken to Iran. He was not arrested. I have to correct you on that. There is no arrest warrant. There is no charges. There is no file. There is no court. There's no nothing. People have to understand the Islamic regime is not a government. There is no justice system. There is no laws. When they do transnational kidnapping, they pick you up somewhere in the world, take you over there, and throw you into their revolutionary courts. What is a revolutionary court? You have one person designated by the regime, in most cases, the hanging judge, she's called the hanging judge Salavati, who will give out death sentences based on whatever propaganda they put out there. So nobody has seen my dad for 4 years. Not the German embassy, not the Swiss embassy on behalf of America, because he is German-American under the Levinson law. He's a US national. And none of the family members, no lawyer could go in there, no human rights organization. He was not in a prison. He was not a prisoner. Nobody knows where they held my father for 4 years. So he's at an unknown location in some torture chamber. And then 2 weeks ago, the Islamic regime that kidnapped him came out and said he was executed. After Germany reacted and closed down all of their embassies, consulates in Germany, the regime changed course and said, no, we didn't execute him.
Yeah.
He died in custody. Yeah. He died. So we can see already, like, you cannot trust a single word that is coming out of their mouth.
Yeah, the latest they're saying is that he died. They don't really explain how he died before his planned execution, which is a strange thing to, I mean, well, you know, to suddenly come out with, as you say. It seems like a reaction to maybe what Germany has done. Well, the reason I said he was arrested, I mean, that doesn't necessarily exonerate the regime or suggest that there's any real reason. That is sometimes what, of course, they do. They arrest under all kinds of odd, bizarre, and bullshit kind of dictates or laws. What is the actual pretext? In other words, what has the regime, what has the government of Iran been saying about why they took your father?
Well, again, there's no government. It's a jihadist power that is occupying the state of Iran and doing all of their terrorism. So what they're saying is very irrelevant. But in the case of any dissident that has worked tirelessly for years, my father was one of those who spoke up against the regime decades ago, you know? So the first thing that the regime does, the first crime, is character assassination. That means they come after you with their propaganda machines. They make you look like a CIA agent, like an FBI agent. My father is a Mossad agent. He's an agent of the German intelligence. He is a terrorist. He is a criminal. He is this, he's that. So they open up all of these cases for you and make you look like a horrible person. Why? Because when you get kidnapped, like in the case of my father, when you get arrested, as you said, again, there's no arrest warrant, no police, no nothing. They then can come in front of the TV and say, we arrested somebody based on these charges, just the same way they do it inside of Iran when there is turmoil, when there is uprising. They don't just shoot people on the street. They arrest them for corruption on earth, for whatever, war against God. Nobody knows what that actually means. It has no value. And then the media, the Western media, picks this up and puts this as their headline. So when my father was kidnapped, the headlines were terrorist ringleader arrested in Iran. Instead of saying activist kidnapped, taken to
Where was
Iran.
that headline? Well, I didn't see that. Somewhere in the West, they called him terrorist ringleader?
of course, they put it in quotation marks, right? They're saying like the Islamic regime is saying that. But when you say that, when you repeat that, you're kind of legitimizing it, right?
Of course,
like
yeah.
Everybody in the Iranian diaspora knows we're activists, we're freedom fighters, we're journalists, like what you're doing right now, podcasters, bringing awareness. And when you do that for a very long time, you get all of these labels on you. So when after years you get kidnapped or assassinated or something happens to you, the Western media repeats what these terrorists say about you. That is one of the biggest crimes of the media. So from here to Japan, all of the news on August 1st, 2020, were terrorist ringleader arrested in Iran. That is one of the complicit things that we see in the Western media, repeating the claims of the terrorists.
Yeah, that's one of the dangers. I mean, two steps back, this may be self-evident, but do you believe your dad was targeted because he was an activist?
Absolutely. I mean, my dad, at the time that the regime started the death threats against him, that was 2007, he created a website for the people of Iran. My dad is by trade a software engineer. So he created a website before we had, Twitter and social media where like people can log in and have anonymous accounts. He created that and protected the IP addresses for the people of Iran. So the regime could not hunt them down and see who's speaking up outside of Iran about the crimes inside of Iran. He provided VPNs before people know what VPNs were. So this website that he created, they could not take it down. And when you cannot take down the website, the portal that you have, they start targeting you, targeting his family, us, and him, up until 2009, when the regime actually sent assassins to Los Angeles to murder my father. And that was thankfully foiled by the FBI. Their agent went to jail here in Los Angeles for a year, and then was then released in what we believe was a prisoner exchange, again with the terrorists. So we see it right now. We see it right now in Canada. You have human rights advocates with assassination plots on them. You have President Trump with assassination plots. You have Masih Alinejad. You have Iran International. You have like so many people, pretty much like the 90s when there was these chain murders, when the regime went out and murdered hundreds of people. This is coming back right now.
And Gazelle, how aware were you, what was he, that he was in danger? I mean, it's part of the horrifying part of this, as you say, whether it's Massey or friends of ours here in Canada or whatever that are targeted. Part of the terrifying part of this is he wasn't in Iran when he was picked up by the regime. He was in Dubai, which we like to think is a place that we can go and vacation or something like that. How aware were you that he was in danger in that moment?
Oh, very aware. I mean, like since the assassination plot on him on U.S. soil, we knew the regime is hunting him down. They want him. They want to get him. So getting out of the U.S. was already very dangerous. And it was during the pandemic that my dad was on a business trip. He had a flight overlay. He didn't even travel to Dubai because we know how many people, how many activists have been picked up in Dubai or in Turkey or in Iraq and taken to Iran. So it wasn't like something that we were not aware of. He's stranded in Dubai and was picked up over there. But throughout all of these years, we were in danger here in Los Angeles, here in America. We had to watch out who's in front of our house, who's calling us, who's trying to get in contact with us. So this is not something rare. It's just not in the news all the time, but the regime has their people here. They're working with like gangs and all of these like proxy groups here, and they're spying on us. They're spying on us. They're looking at us. They're putting us in danger. I mean, look at the Trump administration. How many people have to run around with FBI and protection around their house and around their families?
Let me ask you about media, because you talk about the problem with the media sometimes is, and sometimes it may be less conspiratorial than ignorant, that they are parroting the lines of the Iranian regime, and even when something like Pezeshkian is elected, they say reformist president. They kind of say the types of things that we suspect the regime would want them to say. Those are acts of commission. I want to ask you about acts of omission when it comes to the media. Part of the reason you're on the program is because you wrote to us last week. We had a show last week, and we had a guest who was kind of defending the $6 billion that were sent to the regime last year after the release of hostages. And you wrote, on our page. Hey, why don't you invite me to tell you a bit about the $6 billion deal that left U.S. nationals like your father behind in Iran to die? What happened to the U.S. hostage that was abandoned by Biden? He was just murdered by the regime in Iran 2 weeks ago. What was the response of our president? Nothing. How do I know about that? Because Jimmy is my father and it's been all over the media, except in the U.S. for mainstream American media. Why do you think this story, Gazelle, has been ignored by mainstream American media?
That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. I mean, the media is a big tool, unfortunately, of the Islamic regime, of the terrorists. The terrorists didn't just come into power yesterday. They had 45 years to infiltrate our schools, our academia, our media, our governments, and everything. And this is not a conspiracy, because last year, Sepehr and Iran International put out a big report showing the links between our government officials and the Islamic regime, direct links that are influencing us. This is not new. So over the years, the people who were studying in our schools, studying political science, studying journalism, were trained by people from the regime to have a certain perspective. So that is one part of it, like with the narrative that they have in their head, and that is coming out. The second thing is that our governments, our Western governments, are still doing deals with the Islamic regime. You just mentioned the $6 billion deal. Nowhere in history has any government ever had so much value for a hostage to pay $1.2 billion per head, per hostage. If you can show me any proof of that, I'll take everything back. This has never happened before. So we have to understand that our government is not some benevolent government that has such a big heart for hostages that they were ready to pay $6 billion to get 5 people back. No, this is not what happens. Hostage diplomacy has been a business tool by the regime working together with Western governments since 1979. There has been hostage exchanges for billions of dollars, for political confessions, for criminals that have been released. How do I know that? Because before this hostage deal began, the regime called us and said they want my dad to be part of this. We, of course, were in contact with the State Department, but the State Department blocked us for 3 years. They did not want to talk to us. With other hostages, last September, we were in a sit-in strike in front of the State Department, asking, why is my father not included? Why are you giving this regime billions of dollars and leaving the one hostage that was kidnapped, that is a threat of execution, behind? The media went away when we were standing there. They would interview others and not me. What happened? Some hostages came back. President Biden stood there as the hero of bringing hostages back. Nobody talked about my dad that was abandoned. And as this was happening, as we were handing them the $6 billion, the Islamic regime took my dad and the U.S. government to another court. Nobody in the U.S. reported about that. This is the first time in history the regime in Iran has taken our government to court. Then they started to speak about who is in this court trial. President Biden, President Trump, President Clinton. They named 52 U.S. officials. Did you see that in our media? No. We were again at the State Department, in Congress, speaking about that. Why are you not reacting to this? Why are you not acknowledging that this is happening? In March this year, the regime released the sentenced the U.S. and my father together to pay another $2.5 billion, or they will execute my father. Did you see this in U.S. media?
Okay, well, you've said so much. I want to, first of all, to the people who are looking at this and right now watching us and will say, well, those $6 billion that's not the U.S. giving that money. That's frozen assets that belong to Iran that's being returned. You say what?
These are the frozen assets of the Iranian people, not the occupying force that is using it for terrorism. That's the first point. Second, it doesn't matter if it's our tax dollar money or the Iranian people's tax dollar money. The money in the hand of the regime emboldens the regime to do things like they did 2 weeks later, October 7th, and more kidnappings, and more terrorism, and more crimes against humanity. So it doesn't matter whose money it is in the hands of the regime, or released to Qatari banks, which the regime can then use.
And on the point about the media, so this is the part. It's a bit of a stumbling block for me though, because work me through. I mean, believe me, I get the complicity or even the engagement, which we now know has been happening with at least the current U.S. administration. It's yet to be seen what will happen under a Trump administration, whether things will change, as many Iranians hoping will be the case. But we've seen that kind of engagement with the Biden regime, et cetera. But when it comes to the media, so I mean, for example, like the Denver Post, or I don't know, the Wall Street Journal, or the Miami Herald, they're not covering your dad, this situation. Why? What's the deal that's being done where they are not covering?
If you understand that money regulates everything, like that's one thing we have to come out of this illusion that politicians think about, like policies are created based on human rights and all of that stuff. There is money. There's money being made with the regime. Since 1979 till now, money is made with the regime through stock companies, through other things, through the JCPOA that opened up $150 billion. This is happening. What do you think happens to that money? The money just doesn't go to the regime. Some of it is reinvested into our media, into political campaigns, into think tanks, into all of these things. So this infiltration and manipulation of our way of thinking and of our way of how we portray things in the news, you can see it in the Israel-Gaza war, you can see it in the coverage of the Women Life Freedom Revolution, you can see it especially in my father's case. There are interest groups that don't want the narrative out there that our government is working together with the terrorists inside of Iran. If that wasn't the case, why are we still not pushing and helping the people getting rid of the regime? Why are we still engaging in business deals and billion-dollar deals with the regime? You can see that.
But as you say, I mean, it is interesting that, for example, I've seen coverage of your ordeal and your father in British newspaper, in the Telegraph, something like that. It is interesting that it has been consigned to foreign media, let's say, that is not North American or American media. It does lead to some kind of conspicuousness, as you point out.
Our media has turned for a very long time into campaign tools, either against the administration or for the administration. Honest reporting, neutral reporting, you don't see that anymore. And I don't mean neutral, I mean objective reporting, of what is going on. Asking questions, asking relevant questions. It is a question to everyone why hostage families are brought to the DNC and get a big stage, while other hostage families, like my family, don't even get mentioned in there. We have right now 2 American hostages. One is Hersh Goldberg, that was murdered by Hamas, and the second hostage, Jamshid Sharmahd, that was murdered by the Islamic regime. Why do we focus on Hersh? And he gets some media attention here, but not the Islamic regime, because we still have the ties and the interactions with the regime that our administration was trying to keep up. We know how many times they talked about reviving the JCPOA.
Yes.
What is the JCPOA?
Well, but it's called the nuclear deal, but you tell me what you really believe it is.
Well, the nuclear deal is a front to say that the regime since the 90s, we're saying they're on the verge of creating a nuclear weapon, right? Like it's going to be in 2 weeks, it's going to be in 3 days, it's going to be in 5 days.
It's always
I
imminent.
don't know when this time is going to happen, right? Like any minute, or maybe they have it already. We know we cannot stop them from doing what they're doing. We know that Germany has engaged with business deals that help them to get tunnels and machineries underground where they can hide all of this stuff. So this is a big front. What the JCPOA was actually about was major sanctions relief and the transfer of $150 billion. These money transactions that are going on there, that is the reason why we're still engaging with the regime. That is the reason why the regime is interested. The regime is interested to have a JCPOA. That is the reason why when Donald Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, the biggest complaints came from the companies. Look at the headlines. Boeing is outraged, where we had $50 billion deals for like whatever equipment. Nokia was outraged. Like all of these companies come out because they're interested in continuing their business that they were doing. What do these companies have? Lobby groups. What do lobby groups do? They put pressure on our administration to go into a direction that maintains the business deals that they established. This is the whole story behind it. It's not about nuclear threat.
So when you talk about, as you have, I mean, this is not the first time you've said these things. To a certain extent, you've talked about Germany and the U.S. Shirking responsibility, gross negligence. The negligence part is going to be obvious to anybody who's listening to this. But what would you have hoped, for example, the U.S. government would do, and are you expecting? I guess hoping that things will change after January with a new U.S. administration?
Let me be clear. I'm not a fan of any politician or any party. I feel like many people politically homeless at this time, but I understand that. I don't have to be a fan of my government. My government has to work for me. The number one reason that we have governments since ancient times is to protect us from outside terror, from outside threats. The Islamic regime is right now the biggest threat to each and every one of our security, be it in the Middle East, be it in Europe, be it here in America. When you neglect your citizens that are kidnapped by a terror organization and taken, and you do nothing, you don't speak against it, you don't put pressure, you don't acknowledge it, you don't talk to the family, you have failed in your number one task as a government. That is just number one that everybody has to understand. But what can they do all together? First of all, we need a global outreach. We have to understand what the people of Iran are telling us for 45 years. This is not our government. Stop pretending like they're diplomats. Stop pretending that people like, I don't know, maybe you mentioned before Asadullah Assadi, who was a diplomat stationed in Austria, who was carrying a bomb through Germany to Paris to bomb people, to have an explosion, a massacre over there. These are not diplomats. These are not embassies. They're terror centers. They're espionage centers. Stop legitimizing these terrorists that are holding us hostage. That is the message of the people of Iran every time they come to the streets. And when we think we know better, we know that this is the government and we do deals with them, and we see it's proven to us that they don't even adhere to international law. They engage in kidnappings of foreign citizens. What more has to happen until we all come together and cut our ties with the regime? What does that mean? That means enforcing sanctions. You guys in Canada just put the IRGC on the terrorist list. Is anything enforced? Was anybody arrested? Yeah. Did anything happen? We don't need virtue signaling. We need you to stop the money transfer to the regime. The people of Iran will do the rest.
Yeah, well, that's here. I mean, that's something we've been trying to say repeatedly on this program. Yes, the fact that it took until this past year to even get the IRGC on the terrorist list in Canada, which has, as you know, the second largest, I think, Iranian diaspora, if not the largest now at this point, in terms of all the Iranian immigrants who've come here. We have a stake in this as Canadians as well. Let me ask you a couple of personal questions before I let you go. And I'm so grateful that you've done this on short notice. You reached out and we could make this happen. We started this conversation with you saying you don't actually know the situation with your father. I can't even imagine what it's like to be reading news reports of your father being murdered, or the regime saying that he's died, and not knowing whether that's even true, whether the worst of all outcomes is even true or not. Tell me about how you're processing that emotionally.
I'm not processing. For 4 years now since they kidnapped my father, I'm in a state of crisis, just fighting. Not just for my father, because many people think like I'm an advocate for my father. My father was in America. My father had all his rights. My father didn't need to do anything. He was doing it for the people of Iran. So when I started speaking up, I was making sure that any step that I take for my father is a step for the people of Iran. So I was not out there saying like, yes, please do business deals and hostage negotiations and get my father out there. I was trying to find a solution to all of our problem. And that's what's keeping me up right now. Murdering my father will not stop this. Murdering my father should be the wake-up call to all of these governments that we have done something significantly wrong, purposeful or not purposeful, in these 45 years. We have to change course. We have to hold people accountable. And with we, I mean us, the people. It was not just the regime that kidnapped my father. It was the German government, the European government, the UN, Canada, America that let this happen and didn't show consequences. Where is President Biden now? Why is he not saying anything about this? Why is he not pushing anything about this? We have to hold our own government accountable for failing us on these levels. And I need everyone's support on that. The first thing that we can do is, first of all, demand that he's been brought back. That's the minimum. Bring him back, get him out of the hands of the hostage takers so they don't use his dead body for leverage anymore. Bring him here, investigate, and then go forward and show us how you're going to protect us and the people of Iran from another murder, from another assassination plot. That's what we need.
Well, as somebody who says that you're in a constant state of crisis, which is understandable, and have been for 4 years, you've got a lot of composure and a lot of eloquence in the midst of all of that. Good on you. How will you? Do you think? I mean, I don't even know how to ask. How will you get closure on this?
Our politicians only have power in the West because we give them power. So whatever we want our politicians to do, we have to come together and push for it, united. That is very important. Many people, and I saw on your last show, celebrated, oh, Donald Trump is now in power, it's going to be smooth sailing from... No, it's not going to be smooth sailing. The Islamic regime is not going to sit back and say, okay, there's Netanyahu over there, Trump over there, we lost, bye-bye. They will try to infiltrate and get their deals and get their people into the Trump administration like they did last time. So we have to be very aware of which direction they're going to. We have to be very vocal about what we want. Is it enough for us that they put back the sanctions and just contain the regime? No, because we saw that happen before. Once the Trump administration is gone, there will be another, probably more appeasement-focused administration, and everything will come back. We have 4 years right now to get rid of the regime, and this is in the interest of everybody in this world. If you haven't paid attention to the wars inside of the Middle East or the war that Putin is doing in Europe, this will come to us unless we stop it. And the only way we can stop is, one, to stop any business transaction. Germany is still the biggest business trade partner of the Islamic regime and increased their trade from 2023 to 2024. We still have this regime legitimized at the UN. Just, I think, yesterday, they voted at the UN against abolishing the death sentence. I mean, the murderers get a vote on that. You know, it's just insane what kind of world we live in. We need everybody on board and be focused on delegitimizing the regime, saving the people on the ground in Iran and outside, getting protection for us, and then pushing until all ties are cut with the regime. And with that going forward, the first step that we have to take is to stop the hostage diplomacy. We need an international task force that brings all of these countries together to focus on the hostages that are everywhere in Gaza and Lebanon and in Iran, and stop these individual deals that will only enrich the hostage takers and further more hostage taking.
Gazelle, I thank you so much for doing this today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hope to talk to you soon, and do come visit us in Canada when you can.
Oh, absolutely. When it's safe to come.
Bye-bye. Khudafis. right, let me introduce our feature interview for today's show and the conversation that is related to the title of this program, Iran during World War II, The Overlooked Devastation. So last week we held a book launch here in the Roqe Hub with an author who has been exploring the subject of Iran during World War II and has written a really engaging new book of fiction that helps explore so much of what happened in Iran during that period. The author's name is Sepehr Haddad. Sepehr was born in Washington, D.C. Then in 1965, at the age of 8, his family returned to Iran, where he completed his elementary and secondary school, came back to the U.S. for college, where he ended up at the University of California at Davis and graduated with a master's degree in international agricultural development. He moved from California to Washington, D.C. and began working for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. He is one half of the celebrated musical duo Jian and Sepehr, but he is also now a celebrated author. In 2021, Sepehr released his first novel, 100 Sweet Promises, based on a true family story about a forbidden love between his grandfather and a Russian princess. The protagonist of the story is composer Nasr Sultan Minbashian, Sepehr's grandfather, who would also play a role as one of the pioneering creators of the Iranian contemporary music scene. That book went on to be a #1 Amazon bestseller in the category of Middle Eastern literature. His brand new book is a World War II family saga that takes place in Allied-occupied Iran called The Harmless Necessary Cat. Now, Sepehr flew up from Washington, D.C. to be with us last week, and we had a really compelling conversation in front of a good crowd here at the Roqe Hub. Here is an on-stage interview with Sepehr Haddad about his latest book.
Thank you.
So, first of all, thank you for that reading, and thank you for being here. I think this book is brand new, right? I mean,
Yes,
this is
just a week, 10 days old.
it's just been published.
You're the first person I'm talking with about it.
Wow, we are the first person. We are collectively the first person.
Yes,
you're
all of
talking-
us, so I appreciate you all coming, really.
The most profound effect that this book had on me immediately was to come to terms with my own ignorance about World War II vis-a-vis Iran. I'm a history major. I'm a poli-sci history major. I studied contemporary politics in the Middle East. I know nothing about Iran during World War II. And as I reflect on it, I don't remember anybody talking to me about Iran during World War II. And I regret now that I didn't ask my dad about it, because my dad would have been around at that time. Mom's a little young for it. But I wondered, is that a product of the Eurocentricity of the way history is written for those of us who are in the West? So if I learn history here, I'm learning it from a Western perspective, and that Western perspective talks about this is what Hitler did to Europe, this is the Japanese came and bombed US, but doesn't really give an F about Iran? Or is that also because even in Iran, this period has kind of been written out of history or not written into history? Tell us about that.
Well, I think there are two answers to that. One is the victors write the history. And so the Allies won. And because they won, history is written in that way, where Japan and Germany and Italy, to a lesser extent, were the really, really bad guys. But nobody wants to hear what the Allies did to Iran, where millions died because of their invasion.
By the way, the book is not a validation of Nazi Germany.
Not
Just
at all.
to-
No,
just
no,
in case
no.
anybody thinks you're...
No.
Yeah.
Please, yes. No, not at all. The character in the book, Sohrab Ahangar, is a kid that actually has a German friend and has a German sister-in-law. So he is very happy with these German people that are also helping build his country. They're building the telecommunications, they're building the roads, the railway. And so he doesn't see why Germany's the enemy. He sees the Russians and the British as the enemy because they've invaded his country and humiliated his country. And he wants the British and Russians to be humiliated too. By the end of the story, he thinks differently. That's one. And number two is, if you read ancient history, Herodotus the ancient Greek historian. So the way he wrote about the Persians, he wrote a lot of great stuff about the Persians. But there's one thing that I read that he was talking about the lost army in Libya, the deserts in North Africa, where there was, I don't know how many thousand Iranian or Persian troops at that time just disappeared. It was a sandstorm or whatever it was. And as he's writing that he found a skull in one of these places, he says that I could tell that this was a Persian skull because it was smaller than the usual skull or something like that. So the victors write the history, and they write it whatever way they want.
The victors write the history, but they've really written Iran out of the history here, because it wasn't just that Iran was implicated in World War II by an invasion of the Allies that you talk about in the book, but also that millions died in Iran.
Exactly.
A lot of people, and I just don't remember. I mean, you're right. You don't. I also don't remember very much reading about the Japanese perspective of World War II either, and millions obviously died in that case as well. But it was interesting that, as someone who cares about Iran and Iranian history, and even talking to the equivalent of our village elders, in the Iranian community, I just haven't had, and when we do the Q&A with the audience, maybe it's a corrective. Maybe if you grew up in Iran, you know everything about this period, and it's just that those in the West didn't. But it's instructive that we didn't. Why did you want to focus on this area? Because clearly you can't write a book like this without some kind of due diligence. You don't want Abbas Milani coming after you going, this is ahistorical, what the fuck are you doing? Yeah. So why did you want to focus on this?
Because Iran was not a participant in the war. See, Japan, I can understand. Japan attacked a bunch of countries, occupied countries, the rape of Nanking and so forth. So you have an aggressor, and then if that aggressor gets defeated, and unfortunately many die, you go, okay, well, they started a war. But Iran had nothing to do with that. Iran was a neutral power, both in World War I and World War II. In World War I, Iran became the battleground for Turkish, Russian, and British forces, and about 1 million died. Of course, it also coincided with the flu, the pandemic, the Spanish flu at the time, at the end of the war. And then in World War II, some people are saying 4 million died. Iran at the time had 16 million people. You're talking a quarter of our population died because the Allies decided to attack us, occupy us, and take our food. And that was what just drove me nuts.
Let me get to that. But just to put it very succinctly, the idea was that Iran declares neutrality officially, but the Allies, i.e. the English, who are now teaming up with the Russians and then the US as well, are uncomfortable with the relationship that Iran and Iranians have with Germany, correct?
Correct. US wasn't that involved at that point, and the US involvement actually helped Iran. It's the British and the Russians who said that Reza Shah had leanings towards the Nazis, which of course he did because he was trying to counterbalance the British and Russian influence in Iran. In 1907, I have it in this book, the whole title of this book is based on that, The Harmless and Necessary Cat.
Let me read that up. Okay. It was my next question, actually. Okay. The title.
I read your mind.
Thank you. You are a visionary. The Harmless and Necessary Cat. The cat is Iran. And there's a scene where Sohrab, the young kid, Sohrab's dad has a British political cartoon on the wall that he likes that features the British and the Russians, and this cat in the middle, and they're lampooning Iran by calling it the Harmless and Necessary Cat. How did the Russians and British see Iran as harmless in this period, and how did they see Iran as necessary?
Well, this Punch cartoon from 1907, actually the person who drew it took it, the title, The Harmless and Necessary Cat, from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, where Shylock is defending himself, And he says, hey, you know, because Shylock was a moneylender, and so he creates this whole problem. He's saying, hey, why do you care? I'm almost like the harmless necessary cat that goes and gets the mice and everything. I'm like that. I help the economy, this kind of thing, defending himself. And so that's why the cartoonist used it. It's from Shakespeare 500 years ago. And harmless because Iran hadn't, the cat, I mean, had no claws even. You know, I mean, it was there ready for the taking. Necessary because in World War II, the Persian corridor, from the Persian Gulf to Russia, all the U.S. land lease and also all the material that they needed to send to Russia went through Iran.
The harmless cat stands quite sharply in contradiction to the way Iranians would see themselves, the ferocious lion, right?
That's right. We have a lion on our flag, and if you see the cover of the book, instead of the lion, it's a cat. He still has a sword in his hand because Iranians fought valiantly for 4 days against two major world powers, but they just couldn't do it. And one of the things was that the generals had told Reza Shah, why don't we destroy our bridges, our roads, and all that? And Reza Shah was like, wait, painstakingly, I did all this stuff. I can't do it. And that allowed the Russians to go Jadeh Chalus, the Chalus road, come down and just take Tehran.
I want to get into what happens during World War II. But before we get there, you did this in your other book too. In your first book, where you there's a little bit of a Forrest Gump thing that happens in your writing, where we learn about significant moments in history because you weave them into the fiction of the book, and that's why, like I say, I really quite enjoy this because I'm not just reading a fictionary tale, but I'm kind of reminded of things I've learned about Iranian history or moments that are significant. And so, to wit, in this book, there's a scene where, before World War II, 1936, Sohrab's mom, who's quite religious, and he doesn't feel connected to her, and their home servant Fatemeh, who's also quite religious, they are traumatized and terrorized because they can't go out in the street anymore wearing their hijab because, spoiler alert, in direct contrast to the situation now in Iran, Reza Shah passes this edict that says no one's allowed to wear a hijab. And we see this from their perspective, although Sohrab doesn't necessarily agree with their religiosity. Why did you want to include that?
Well, first of all, even though it's historical fiction, most of this is true. So Fatima was a servant girl in my father's house. And this had happened to her. She had gone to the mosque one day, and the mullah had said, if one strand of your hair shows under your hijab, with that one strand of hair, you will be held over hellfire. And so Fatemeh was really superstitious and just took that to heart. And so she had gone to the bazaar in Qazvin one day, and they came and they said, take it off. And she said no, and she actually bites the chador like they used to do in Iran with their teeth when it was windy or whatever. So she's biting it, and they pull it off so violently from her that she falls on the ground, starts sobbing that everybody's seeing her hair. She had a mental breakdown. But the reason I put that in there was twofold. One was to show that 100 years ago, they were beating women to take it off. And 100 years later, they're beating women to put it on. And how terrible are the men who beat women whenever they think they want what they want the women should do. I mean, it's a terrible thing. I mean, as a man, I feel terrible that 100 years ago, we're beating women. 100 years now, later, we're beating, I mean.
About the same object of clothing.
About the same object of clothing. It's ridiculous. So that's why I put it in there. To say, hey, you know.
Because there's a few parallels. You mentioned it just a few moments ago. There's a few parallels that you also draw between Nazi Germany and the current government of Iran, subtly, but it's interesting to me, for example, that we mistakenly think of Germans as a monolith. Like we think of everything, so we go, oh, Germans, 1940s, terrible people, and of course there were Germans who opposed the Nazi regime, and Krista, who is the wife of Arash Sohrab's brother, one of the reasons she leaves Germany is because she is traumatized by this Nazi regime, and she's part of a resistance. And the way you write about it, and you draw some links in there, feels very much like Iranians today, at odds with this another version of a Nazi regime, if you will. I mean, it's there's always troublesome using those terms, but the only major disconnect being that the Nazis were elected in a way that the current regime in Iran is not. But
well, I didn't really I didn't equate Nazism with the current regime. I just didn't, because I think that's not what I was trying to get at. What I was trying to get at is that the same way that the mullahs in the mosques with their sermons were able to ensnare and utilize people's suspicion, the Nazis were able to do the same thing through these radio broadcasts, where they would say the great nation of Iran will soon be freed from the shackles of the Bolsheviks and the communists and all that. And so they were giving hope to the people through these still kind of fake hope, That's how I was comparing them.
The relationship of Iranians and Germans is fascinating. First of all, very affectionate. Very affectionate. The Iranians in this story, at least, are very pro-German, pro-Germany. You mentioned Sohrab's best friend is Karl, who's this German kid. And there's a very positive feeling about Germany based on some of the industrial work that have been done in Iran. Can you explore that?
Well, as I said, Germany was involved in all aspects of Iran's development under Reza Shah. So railway, telecommunications, roads, bridges, just everything. Even helping in some small way in the military, training military and so forth. And so Iranians, when the Russians and the British, before they bomb, they throw leaflets down and say, leave the city, we're here to save you from the Germans. And Sohrab, I'm like, I see a flyer and I'm like, save us from who? From my sister-in-law that I love, from my friend that I love, from these guys that are helping build our country? Why are you dragging your war on our doorstep? So Iranians actually liked the Germans. Even and I write, there's one section in here where there's a manservant called Haydar who becomes like a brother to me. And he's telling me, he says, and this is true, this is also true. So I did a lot of research, and most of this is true. I can say most of it, except for some characters. But he says, and this is true, I read this, that in the kind of sort of poorer parts of Tehran, when they were showing, the British would show war movies, and they would always show the British winning and all that. But the people were cheering and jeering at the British and cheering when the Germans would beat the British. And the British didn't like it. The more that people would cheer for Germany, the British couldn't understand why Iranians are cheering for the Germans and then booing when the British would win something,
Well, and there's the scene in Meydan Sepehr, which is it's quite a remarkable scene. I mean, it's a pro-Germany rally, right? That was regularly held.
Right. Every week they had this. Actually, they had radios. People had shortwave radios, so you could tune in. And so at some point, the British realized these are getting too popular, so we're going to stop this public broadcasting. But it didn't work because people had radios in their homes, so they go listen to it. And then, by chance, an irony, that the British asked the radios be put back because nobody would be listening to the British news broadcasts. So,
I just got to note that you're popping your peas, so you just stay a little further away from the microphone.
Peter Piper.
You mentioned earlier, I mean, a major component of both what Reza Shah built and the impetus of the Russians and the British coming into into Iran in this period is the Trans-Iranian Railway. And you mentioned something called the Persian Corridor. What is that and why was it relevant?
Well, when Russia and Britain finally became allies, Russia was doing really badly during the war. I mean, they were afraid, the Allies were afraid that Germany is going to come through the Caucasus, take over Baku and the oil there, and then come on down and take Abadan. The refinery at Abadan produced, I forget how many, but like 8 million barrels a day at the time, or something like that. I don't know the exact number. But the British had just changed their military ships from coal to oil. And so they needed that. If the Germans came and took that, and they thought that the Germans are going to come both through North Africa with Rommel, the Africa Corps, and through the Caucasus. So they needed to stop that. One way they were doing it was by ships going to the ports in the north of Russia. But now it was getting icy wintertime, and also the U-boats. The Germans decided to use their U-boats. So they needed another route that was safer. So they had to come and basically take over Iran, to take over that railway that Reza Shah had built with such hardship. That's the Persian Corridor, where it was, you know, they give it names like that to make the Persians feel good, I guess. You know.
There's something you and I talked about a few days ago. We talked about it on the phone, and then it was in the book, where it's your contention that, you know, Iranians in the 20th century develop a notable anti-Western attitude. And before everybody says, no, we love American genes and all of that, it does culminate in the 1979 revolution, for better or for worse, and for some, obviously for much worse, but some see that anti-Western, whether it's anti-colonial, whether it's anti-British, whether it's anti-American sentiment, that the inflection point is Mossadegh in 1953. Some may argue it was always there, but you think it's this period. You think it's the Allied invasion that before that, Iranians are, as a people, relatively West positive. But when you start getting bombed by the British and the Russians, it's like we're not so pro-West anymore.
Well, not only bombed, as I said, the food. So the Russians needed food to support their troops. So they took all the harvest from the Caspian area, the north of Iran, and shipped it for their soldiers fighting the German war machine. And the British mismanaged the harvest in the south of Iran, mismanaged the water and all that kind of stuff. And so my belief is that, you know, everybody talks about Mossadegh was the time when the Iranians started hating the US and the British for overthrowing, you know, Mossadegh. But Mossadegh was in 1953. This invasion was in 1941. So 12 years earlier, I think that that's a much stronger reason to hate the West if you're an Iranian at that time, is that they've invaded you. They've humiliated you. They've taken your food. 3 to 4 million of your people, if you believe some of the researchers, but I think it might have been closer to 2 million, but still, died. You know, so Mossadegh is just a symptom. The root cause was 1940.
I'm pretty sure that's a contentious point. And maybe
Right.
some people will be able to talk about that, but it's an interesting one for sure. You mentioned earlier Sohrab's sympathies with the Nazis. He's like, these are not the people who have dropped bombs on us or leaflets and he has a good feeling about Germans, and he has German friends, and he goes to those, he hears about Hitler, and he doesn't necessarily have a bad impression. And there's this interesting juxtaposition, the moment in the book where Karl, his close friend who's German, is trying to explain to Sohrab, no, the Nazis are bad.
Yeah.
German, and he's like, but I like Germans. What? Explore that a little bit, because assuming that you have some relationship to Sohrab, that's an interesting thing that you went through.
Well, Sohrab is a teenager at this point. So first of all, he doesn't know much. It's all what he's seeing. And he is seeing, as I said, the British and the Russians coming in, troops, you know, everywhere they're going, it's hard to go, tanks and troops and all that. And in Ghazvin, Sohrab's cousin's house gets bombed. And so they go to see it firsthand. And everybody's just shocked. They're shocked at why. I mean, Iran's not involved in this war. So Sohrab is not pro-Nazi. He's pro-German. That's the difference. He doesn't even know about Nazis. And that's the whole thing. Karl keeps trying to tell him, no, I was there. He remembers Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. And he keeps telling him, and still he doesn't get it. And he says, you know, Kristallnacht happened because they say a Jewish man, assassin, killed the German ambassador to Paris, or consul general in Paris. And Sohrab saying, but there's this nice Jewish man who's my father's friend, sells carpets in the bazaar. Why? Why would they hate the Jewish people? You know, he doesn't get it. So he doesn't know about not that. He likes Germans. He likes their war efficiency. He doesn't know, and even Karl's uncle in this, he's a Luftwaffe pilot. So it's a pro-German, not a pro-Nazi feel that he has. That's
the famine, the starvation, and the devastation. It seems like a dumb thing, even by the standards of the people bombing Iranians into wanting to love them. It seems like a dumb thing to do to the Iranian people. What were the Russians thinking?
The Russians didn't care. The Russians were thinking, our soldiers are fighting the Germans. These Germans have come, they've raped our women, they've destroyed our country, and I'm going to do anything I can to protect my country, even if it means I have to go into Iran and take their food. That's what they thought. It's like almost any country might do that if you feel you're at the point of defeat by an outside force. You know, that's what I think.
By 1943, you talk about how Tehran is transformed. It's overrun with British soldiers, American soldiers at that point as well, who are kind of becoming the hustle and bustle of the city. It's a pivotal year because it's when the Tehran Conference happens. Talk about how important that year is, not just for World War II, but in Iranian history.
Well, 1943 is very important because so Stalin was afraid to fly. So he decides to take a train from Baku to come to Tehran. That's why Tehran was chosen, because Stalin didn't want to go anywhere else. And so Roosevelt and Churchill agree. And this was their first meeting where they were going to decide the D-Day invasion. And there's a lot of historical background about how actually Stalin and Roosevelt were more on the same page than Churchill was. And there is a funny story. I didn't write it in the book. I'd like to say it. It's a little risque. But so Stalin was very suspicious of the friendship of Roosevelt and Churchill. He knew that they had met in different places and they were very close. And so they decided to have the meeting in the Soviet embassy on Khiyabun Churchill, whoever remembers it in Iran. And actually, our mutual friend Fred Parvane, his family had a house right across the Russian embassy on Churchill Street. So whenever I'd go to visit him as a kid, we'd always look in there. We could see and there was always a secret savak outside in a paycon. We always used to see these two. The two guys were out there. Everybody knew that these guys are like savak looking at the embassy. But anyway, so supposedly there was even a tunnel built between the Russian embassy and the British embassy because they were very close to each other. in downtown Tehran. So that the meetings were held in the Russian embassy because there was a fear, or at least Stalin's people had said, that they're going to try to do some sort of an attack, the Germans. And so the Russian embassy is the most safe and secure. So they were having the meetings there. During one of these meetings, Stalin notices that Churchill and Roosevelt are passing a note between each other. And he gets very kind of curious, and he's kind of a little jealous, envious. And so he tells, when the meeting's over, he tells his chief of security at the time, was a man named Ivanovich Against. And he says, find out what they were talking about. But I don't want you to tell me what they were talking about. I read this in a Russian book.
I was going to say, where did you know?
No, in a Russian book. It's called Tehran 1943 or something. Operation.
Oh, you were like in a barber shop and somebody.
Yeah. And he said, Stalin told me. And so Alliance goes and finds the actual note. And the note was a note from Roosevelt to Churchill saying, "Sir, your fly is open." And Churchill writes back on that same note, he says, "No worries, the old eagle will not fall out of its nest." So it was that level of, intrigue between the three of them, even though they were about to basically take over the world.
And it didn't make the book. Story of Iran.
I didn't put it in on purpose because I wanted to use it today.
Before we open it up for any questions or comments from the crowd here, there's a very moving Sepehr. You do an author's note at the beginning of the book, and there's it ends in a very moving way. And you say, you've clearly done a lot of research to do this book. It's one thing to write a book of creative fiction or creative nonfiction. It's another to place it somewhere where you have to do the historical work. And you say, if I'm paraphrasing you, if I can quote you, you say, what you learned in this process, writing this book, was that you are in awe of the resilience of the Iranian people.
Their spirit.
Yeah, talk about that.
Well, really, as I was doing this research, and and also what's not in the book is, of course, the years that I lived in Iran and how Iran was moving forward, and then all of a sudden the revolution happened, and then how it's now being bad-mouthed all around the world, even though the people are the people. And so my whole point was that the ethos of Iran is not found in just that land. It's found in every fabric of what Iranian culture is. And I say in there, in every note of a sitar, every, thread of a Persian carpet, every motif of Persian art, and that it's in the collective memory of the culture, no matter where they are. Like us right now, we're mostly Persian here, Iranian, and value Iranian culture, value Iranian art. You don't have to be sitting in Tehran to do that. And we're sitting here in Toronto, Canada, speaking about it and being proud of what this country is all about. That's why I wrote it.
But the resilience part.
Yes, resilience. And, you think about it, 700 years of Arab conquest, something like that, I think, that many years, still couldn't crush the Iranian spirit. Even what's happening now in Iran, still the Iranian spirit lives, and it will live. It will continue. I can guarantee that. I'll say it.
And thank you so much for being here. Have some wine. Sepher Haddad.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Big thanks to Sepehr Haddad and his wife for coming up here from Washington, D.C. to be part of our event last week. His new book really is worth reading. If you have a chance to pick it up, go to Amazon, wherever you get your books in, and order it. Not only is it instructional about Iran's history, but it's a compelling read. Thanks to him. Thanks to everybody who came out last week to our Roqe Hub. We're going to be doing more of those things, so stay tuned, especially if you're in the greater Toronto area. Thanks to the amazing team who put this show together each week. Super Parisa, Smart Pega, Seppi Wonder, Savvy Roham, and Tina, the photo and video queen. And special thanks to Bearded Omid, Talented Anahita, Methodical Kaveh, and Solid Samin. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Do subscribe if you haven't done so already. You can find Roqe across our platforms at Roqe Media. Find me on Instagram at Jian Gomeshi. And as ever, Mizun Bashin.